Hi everybody, welcome to our day of Health in Action. It's very nice to see so many people here and to feel this energy that this reinvigorated Medact has initiated. I'm Gill, Walt, and I am one of the patrons of Medact. I'm very happy to be here. I've also been a member for many, many years, and it's nice to see some familiar faces here. As well as lots of new faces. You've got the program for today, and so I've got a few messages about things like workshops. There are some great workshops this afternoon. The difficulty is going to be choosing which one to go to. But if you haven't already chosen, please do go downstairs at tea time, at the break, or certainly by lunchtime, and choose one of them. They're all at reception. As you've noticed, as you've puffed up the stairs, this is a long way away from tea and coffee. We are going to try and keep to time, so please, when you do go for tea, well, you could think even of not having tea, but if you can't bear the thought of that, then when you go down, grab your cup of tea or coffee, drink it, and come back up here quite quickly, please. For those who are having a lovely day and want to keep talking, there's going to be a social at 6 o'clock. So anybody who wants to hang around and keep chatting, that will be at a Greek taverna near here, and the details are all at reception. So again, talk to people on the desk. And then finally, these things don't just happen, they take a huge amount of organisation. And I'd like to thank, on behalf of Medact, who has organised this day in partnership with Health Poverty Action. You've seen some of the people around volunteering. I want to say thank you very much, particularly to Victor, who has been one of the main organisers of the whole show, and Goody Singh, both at Medact, and also to Jess Scott at HPA. And then there are a lot of volunteers here, so thank you all very much for giving up your time and being here and shepherding us around and giving us all information. And then finally to Lisa and the London School for putting on this, giving us access to a very fine venue. So that's the thank yous. What we're going to do now is have a plenary session where, unfortunately, David Held, Professor Held from Durham, had to withdraw at the very last minute. So we're very sad that he isn't here. However, we do have Dave McCoy, who's the director of Medact and who has been in public health for a long time and has brought lots of new energy to the organisation, is going to talk to us initially. And then we're very fortunate in having Ron Labonte from the University of Ottawa, who happens to be here at the moment working in Oxford with Jeff Stuckler and others who you may well know about. And Ron is going to introduce us to the latest copy of the alternative annual report on the world's health, Global Health Watch. So he's going to tell us about that. And it is on sale at reception, so if you would like a copy, and I heartily recommend it, if you want to read about the bridge between the global issues and local issues, it's all there. So without more ado, can I hand over to Dave and start the morning's proceedings?
Thanks, Gill. I'm going to be really quick because the absence of David Held gives us more opportunity for discussion and comments from the floor and the plenary. But I wanted just to remind us of what happened last year. This is last year. We had a conference where Medact was relaunched. And here you can see Charlie Cronick from Greenpeace, Guppy Bola, Richard Horton from The Lancet, Jackie Davis from Keep NHS Public, and Andy Haynes from the London School, all gathering to relaunch Medact last year. And in many ways, I think the relaunch of Medact was an excuse. It was really an excuse to gather together the progressive health community to talk about a number of worrying concerns and issues that had emerged. There was the abolition of the NHS through the Health and Social Care Act, which, to my mind, embodied political deceit. It embodied the public interest failings of the BBC and the mainstream media, and it showed up the huge influence of corporations, private corporations and management consultancy firms over the shaping of policy and legislation in this country. There were concerns about climate change as an impending global health crisis. There was the banking crisis and austerity. We're seeing now a rise in the number of deaths due to war and armed conflict and the continued threat of nuclear war. And we talked about and identified inequality as being a major determinant of poor health. Andy Haynes talked about the interconnectedness between climate change, economic inequality, and threats of war, and suggested that we needed an organization like Medact that was able to weave these different issues together into a holistic and coherent analysis. Richard Horton talked about the need for Medact to hold institutions to account, the need for a watchdog. And John Hillary from War on Want talked about the vital role of health professionals in providing an alternative to dominant neoliberal politics and economics. So we all gathered last year, and I think there was a general agreement that an organization like Medact was needed. So what's happened since last year, since that relaunch? Well, quite a lot has happened. Amongst the things that have happened is work that Medact is doing around tax and health. We're trying to produce a series of papers to describe the various interrelationships between tax as a public policy issue and health as an outcome. Tax avoidance and illicit flows of finance, as I'm sure many of you know, amount to hundreds of billions of dollars every year, and is one reason why wealthy countries like Sierra Leone and Liberia remain poor. And we know that tax avoidance occurs here in the UK, and that it also affects companies working in the NHS. So last year we launched a campaign against the tax avoidance practices of Boots, our high street chemist in England. It's been estimated that they've avoided legitimate tax payments worth £1.2 billion since 2007. And on top of this, Boots, 40% of Boots's revenue comes from the NHS. And there are many other companies that currently profit from the NHS without necessarily providing a good service to patients, but who make no contribution to the financing of the NHS. And tax is, of course, not just a source of public revenue, but it's also a mechanism to influence healthy behavior, for example, tobacco taxes. It's a reason to regulate industries that need to be regulated. Currency transaction, the arms trade, commodities trading, illicit drugs. And there are also important relationships between tax, democracy, and governance. So we're going to be pushing to make tax a critical and important central public health issue next year. Tax is, of course, fundamental to this picture. And we discussed last year and talked about inequality being an underlying cause of many of the social pathologies that then result in human pathologies. 2 weeks ago, we helped to organise and ran a conference here in the London School on PFI, described as legalised theft and the private plunder of the public purse by one of the speakers at this conference. Why are we getting one hospital for the price of two? Why is it that we're exchanging public sector nurses and hospital beds for bank bonuses? Why is it that PFI contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars of public money are kept secret? Why is it that the new PFI hospital in the capital city of Lesotho is consuming nearly half of the public budget for health in the entire country? So PFI is really an abomination that needs to be addressed, and we're going to be working to campaign against this next year. We've also been running a number of public seminars on a variety of topics, and here is one that we co-hosted with the Faculty of Public Health and the Royal Society of Medicine on TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and I suspect that Ron might be covering some of this in his talk later on. Medact continues to campaign against Trident as a dangerous, ineffective and costly threat to global health. And last year saw the launch of the Wellcome Trust archive of Medact. Here are some photographs from that archive which documents the history of the medical campaign against nuclear weapons, the history of the Medical Association for the Prevention of War, the two organizations that then came together to form Medact 22 years ago. We are actively supporting ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, and continue to be part of IPPNW, with lots of attention being focused now on the third international conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear war, which is now re-galvanizing the international movement to ban nuclear weapons. Over 180 countries are attending the Vienna conference next month. The UK is not one of them. Instead, we have this from our government. David Cameron's a recent passage from a speech that David Cameron just gave to the Australian Parliament, talking about how our economic prosperity underpins our national security, which we're using now to modernize our armed forces with the most modern equipment, including new hunter-killer submarines and the renewal of our nuclear deterrent. This is one reason why next year Medact will be placing a lot more attention on reviving the medical peace movement. It was a movement that was strong and vibrant in the 1980s, but it seems to have disappeared. We've got to revive and rejuvenate this movement. Last year also saw us help produce a report on the atomic weapons establishment. This is the establishment that maintains and develops Britain's nuclear weapons, and we looked at the links between the AWE and funding in British universities. More sinisterly, AWE, I don't know how many people are aware of this, although government-owned, is in fact run by a consortium of 3 multinational companies, including the world's largest arms company, the scandal-ridden outsourcer Serco, and a Fortune 500 conglomerate. We've been working on climate change. Here are 2 reports that we produced, trying to summarize and communicate the information that's been produced by the IPCC. And we're involved in a campaign to get the leading health institutions in England to divest from fossil fuel. This is the fossil-free health campaign that we're working on with the Climate and Health Council and with the student body Healthy Planet. This is a slide from data produced by a group in Oxford, looking at the carbon footprints of the different sectors and services and human activities. Currently, this is data from 2010, and what I want to draw your attention to is the role of our food system in the production of greenhouse gases. The food system, there are many problems with the food system. It is inefficient, it is inequitable, it is dominated by an oligopoly of food industries, but it is also a huge contributor to global warming. So we have begun to start a program of work with a coalition of other NGOs to look at how we can reduce meat consumption as a contributor to our efforts to fight climate change and global warming. A couple of weeks ago, we helped to organize a meeting on the use of antibiotics in agriculture. And that while there is now a lot of attention on antibiotic use in the human sector, there's been less attention on its use in the agricultural sector. In the UK, we have now measurable targets to reduce antibiotic use in medicine, but we have no such targets for its reduced use in the farming sector. So we're now working with a group of other organisations to challenge the government to set such targets and to ban the routine preventative use of antibiotics in farming, such as happened in the Netherlands and in Denmark. Fracking is not a source of clean energy. Neither is it really a stepping stone towards the greater use of renewable energy or of energy efficiency more generally. It is also clearly unsafe given the lack of regulatory standards and capacity we have in England, and the net social and economic impacts of fracking are almost certainly negative for local communities. We are now working with a group of academics, public health specialists and communities from across the country to produce a position paper and statement on fracking that we hope to release in January or February next year. And this is partly in response to the evaluation on the safety of fracking that was produced by Public Health England, which I think most people would agree was inadequate and misleading. We continue to be actively working on issues to do with medical complicity in torture, human rights. This is a chair that is used in Guantanamo Bay to restrain hunger strikers, to enable the forced feeding of those hunger strikers. And we're also, again, working with the Royal Society of Medicine in providing training for frontline clinicians in the documentation of evidence of torture. We're also working to produce a Cochrane systematic review of the clinical management of hunger strikers. We've spoken out against the attack and indiscriminate bombing of Gaza, and have supported medical fact-finding missions to Gaza to document the effects of those attacks. We are producing a number of blogs which we hope are informative, challenging and provocative. And we've spent a lot of time in the last year trying to define what Medact is. Who is Medact? What is it? How does it work? And here's a diagram from our annual report which attempts to do that. Fundamentally, Medact is an organization that does two things. It informs and it educates, and it conducts advocacy and campaigning. But it does so on the basis of three foundations, three building blocks. The first is a set of very explicit normative values and principles. The second is we are evidence-based, we are data-led, we conduct research and analysis to back up our positions and our views, and that in turn helps to provide us with alternatives. We're not just against things, but we're also in favor of things. This need, I think, to combine activism with academia is reflected and illustrated by a series of lectures that we're now co-organizing with Queen Mary University, explicitly about harnessing academia to policy and politics. So we produce a set of public lectures once a month in London now. Okay, so we've been busy doing lots of things in lots of areas. Have we been effective? And it's really easy to be loud without being heard, and it's really easy to be active without having any impact. And Medact is a tiny organization. It is small. It's a little ant. I mean, I think we might punch above our weight, but we are not going to be effective unless we are able to work with other organizations, unless we are able to leverage the support of other health organizations and the voice of the community of 1 million health workers that live in the UK. So part of Medact's strategy is not to do things on its own, but it's about working with and through other organizations. Medact needs to pull. The point of Medact is about pulling the health community in a more progressive and socially just direction. Unless we work with other organizations, I think I think we can't expect to be very effective or to have much impact. We've got to work, and we are working with a number of organisations in a collaborative manner. We have alliances with the Royal Society of Medicine, with the Climate and Health Council, Medical Justice Network, the Helen Bamber Foundation, as I mentioned earlier, Healthy Planet. We've got to try and develop links also with the wider community, with community-based organisations like the People's Health Movement in the UK and Citizens UK, and working collaboratively with international NGOs. So we're currently working in partnership with Friends of the Earth, with Amnesty International, with War on Want. These are all important organisational strategies in order to enable us to be effective as an organisation. Many of the issues that we are concerned with are global in nature, and they will require global solutions. So again, we're looking to develop links with sister organisations in other countries. These are a few of them, and they include Medico International, and we've got Thomas Gebauer here from Germany, who will be speaking about their work. We're also working with Health Poverty Action, and you'll notice that this conference is co-organised with them. Health Poverty Action have their feet on the ground in some of the poorest countries, working with some of the poorest and most marginalised communities. So there is a reason why we are working in partnership with them, why we are forming an alliance with them, why we consider them to be a sister organisation. Not only are they working on the ground in these communities, but they're also providing valuable and important analyses. This was a report they produced last year, looking at the imbalance in the inflow and outflow of resources into and out of Africa. So how are we going to do this? I mean, this all sounds great, but the reality is that turning an organisation like Medact into something effective that can have impact is not easy. It requires a lot of collaboration, cooperation, alliance building. We have a tiny office, we have a board, we have a number of project groups and activity groups. We're about to set up a series of expert councils and people who will want to drive these 4 programs of Medact, the Peace and Demilitarization program, the Ecology and Climate program, the Economic Justice program, the Health and Human Rights program. But vitally, Medact will only be effective if the office works effectively through a very strategic plan, but also if its members and local area groups are also operating in a way that may be quite independent from the way the office operates. That we need a mixture of a kind of top-down strategic organisation, but also the generation of a movement from below, of doctors, nurses, and other health workers working at a local level, working in their hospitals, in their GP practices, and obviously in collaboration with partners outside of the health sector. I don't know exactly how we're going to do this, but what I do know is that this conference provides an opportunity to brainstorm some of these issues, and I hope that we can use this conference to also not just satisfy your thirst for knowledge or for you to develop new skills or to establish new friendships, but to help us think about how Medact now embarks on its next phase of development, post-relaunch, post-rejuvenation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dave. And I think that's really helpful to give us an idea of what Medact is doing and what it is hoping to do in the future. And it's a cry for people to get involved. Let's now turn to Ron Labonte, who's going to talk to us about the alternative report on the world's health, which gives a slightly different view than that which comes from the World Health Organization. And he's going to talk about Global Health Watch 4. Ron.
Thank you. Just allow me to get a glass of water before I start. Okay, well, I want to begin by saying that I am really remarkably impressed with the work that Medact has been doing, and that the issues that Medact has been tackling are very similar, of course, to the issues that People's Health Movement and Global Health Watch for and all the other organizations involved with it have been trying to undertake. Now, Global Health Watch 4 is actually part of a family of health reports that go back starting in the early 2000s. So it's the fourth of our alternative World Health reports. And as you can sort of see, it's also part of a family of international organizations that are aligned with the goals of health for all, aligned with the idea of a critical perspective on what are the determinants of reaching health for all. And this gives you a bit of an idea of what the actual content topics are of the Global Health Watch 4. So I got to say, here I am. I'm officially launching it. It is now launched. I think it actually was just released from the publisher about a day or two ago. I'm actually going to focus on the first part because that was my contribution to this particular report, which is the health crises of a neoliberal globalization. David already talked a little bit about that in terms of the approach that Medact is taking. I'll start by sort of saying that some of what I'm going to tell you is probably what you've already know, but I want to try to link a number of themes together in doing so. And that a lot of it is initially very depressing in the sense of what we know is happening at a global scale. I continue to be an optimist, which I consider to be not a personality defect, but a deliberate political strategy. And also that something that the Global Health Watch 4 touches on. There's quite a lot of information in this particular edition coming out of Latin America. And the reason for that is quite deliberate. I think as many of us know, there are much more kind of socially just or social democratic experiments going on in that part of the world right now. And there are some pockets of that happening in areas of Southeast Asia. So I don't think that we should necessarily believe, as Margaret Thatcher might have told us once upon a time, that there is no alternative. There indeed are alternatives. It's also kind of useful to think about the fact that this era of globalization, or what I would call a 40-year uncontrolled experiment in neoliberal economic orthodoxy at a global scale, we have seen, though, a number of very positive health outcomes. The child health revolution in the 1970s and the 80s, diffusion around gender rights, global obligation, imperfectly expressed in the Millennium Development Goals. And economists like to talk about the virtuous circle, that as countries and economies interpenetrate through liberalization, they grow. When they grow, they become wealthy. When they become wealthy, there's less poverty. When there's less poverty, they're more productive and they grow again. Unfortunately, that particular economic theory, which is part of the neoliberal orthodoxy, has very little empirical substantiation, which doesn't mean that countries should not globalize with each other. But what form of globalization that takes is what becomes critical. And then we've had arguments that we've managed to decrease extreme poverty. But for almost all of these, there are contrary and countervailing forces that have to be addressed. So new health technologies that could continue to reduce health inequalities worldwide are now coming under the rubric and the scrutiny and the control of intellectual property rights. Yes, we have increased gender rights, but a lot of women who are employed in low-income countries, we think about Bangladesh, for example, and the textile workers, there's a lot of exploitation. There's the global care chain by which women emigrate and become personal care workers, for example, in Canada, and leave their families behind in the Philippines. We do have a growing sense of global obligation, but it's articulated as charity and not as entitlement, with very little analysis. And in fact, in the Millennium Development Goals, better now with the Sustainable Development Goals, but nonetheless in Millennium Development Goals, absolutely no analysis as to why these inequalities arose in the first place. And decreased extreme poverty, do we actually have a rising tide, or do we have sinking ships? And yes, it's true that poverty rates have fallen at that extreme level since 1981, but they've actually, in terms of absolute numbers, are increasing at this $2.50 a day level, what are described as being relatively poor but not absolutely poor, a term that Guy Standing has tried to study and talk about the precariat, a new kind of social class globally in the making. 0 hours contract in the UK is a good example of the precariat. But do we even have the right poverty goal? The purchase power parity, World Bank estimates have been found to grossly underestimate poverty. The extreme poverty goal of the Millennium Development Goal Declaration was actually achieved before it was announced because of clever backdating and a shift from absolute to relative, and mostly thanks to China. Now, we've recommitted to eliminating extreme poverty by 2030 at the $1.25 a day level, but various health estimates or other kind of life satisfaction or life purpose estimates would suggest that we need a minimum of $5 a day consumption in order for people to achieve any kind of a realistically decent life. And UNCTAD did some number crunching on that and said that even if we achieved this elimination of the $1.25 day level, if we looked at the $5 a day poverty cutoff instead, we would still have in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa the huge overwhelming proportion of the population still living below that $5 a day minimum level. So inequalities matter enormously. And David's already shared the wonderful little kind of finding by Oxfam about the 85 people having as much as the world's poorest bottom half. Another way of expressing that is an estimate that I came up with, that is if you take a look at all the entire population of Africa and India, which is, 2.2 billion, and even adjusting for the billionaires that live in those continents already, 1,400 people have as much wealth as that entire kind of sector of the human population. Why is this so? Why has this happened? What are some of the drivers of this? And this is some of the information that comes out of the work of Thomas Piketty and Edward Said in the United States that basically tracks that there's a direct relationship between the rising wealth of the 1% and actually the 0.01% and declining rates of unionization. So we've seen under neoliberal globalization, we've seen this whole move towards labor market competitiveness, flexibilization, 0 contract hours, and a direct relationship. As labor becomes weaker, capital becomes stronger. And you see that if you look internationally. So here's, at a global scale, the decline in the share of world economic output going to labor. The rest of it is going to capital. That's a pretty precipitous decline when you realize that so few people control capital and so many people rely upon labor. Here's some data that we looked at very recently in the work that I've been doing with David Stuckler, and you find that this pattern is the same. It's the same in Canada, it's the same in the UK in particular, across OECD nations as an average, and in the US. And as union membership declines, so does the share of GDP going to labor. So one of the actual obvious, if not particularly easy, but obvious kind of policy areas that we need to be promoting in public health is strengthen labor rights, not weakened labor rights. Now, I mentioned that this is kind of like the 40-year uncontrolled experiment in neoliberalism, which really began in the 1970s and took off in the 1980s. And the late Scottish Australian health economist Gavin Mooney, in his last book, was pretty clear, saying that if we really cared about promoting health or about creating health, We needed to end this neoliberal orthodoxy. What do we mean when we talk about neoliberalism? There are some academic colleagues of mine back at the University of Ottawa who say they ban the use of that term in their class because it's too much of a simplistic shorthand. But in fact, it's not that much of a simplistic shorthand if you unpack it just a little tiny bit. So the origins, without going back into the classical liberal economic and moral philosophers of the 17th century, the modern incarnation of liberalism or neoliberalism really owes itself to Friedrich von Hayek, the Austrian, later British, later American economist, who defined it essentially that free markets, sovereign individuals, free trade, strong property rights, and minimal government is the surest way of exactly or ensuring or enhancing human well-being. Now, part of his argument is that the economy was far too complicated for governments to try to regulate. And there's a certain amount of truth in that. I don't think our command-control economies really necessarily helped human health all that much, and certainly not planetary health. So he argued that really you needed to free these choices of individual sovereign consumers and producers. And if you did that, we'd have this massive enhancement of human well-being. A couple of Keynes or Keynesian economists and colleagues at the time expressed this belief somewhat differently, that the nastiest of men for the nastiest of motives were somehow work for the benefit of all. And as we've seen, as neoliberalism has taken its 40-year course since the 1970s and 1980s, this rather prescient notion from the 1940s, a caution against neoliberalism, has borne out. So, dealing a little bit more contemporary now and trying to look at how this plays out with respect to the financial crisis. And a very simplified story. Now, this is explained a bit more detail in the opening chapter of Global Health Watch 4. But capitalism goes through these episodic crises, so-called like business cycles, whatever you want to call them, but overproduction and underconsumption. And so you have declining rates of profit. Now, economic theory says that then unproductive capital should disappear. It should be destroyed in that, and only productive capital will survive. But in the 1970s when this happened, two new ideas emerged on the part of those who were earning a lot of money out of the capitalist market system. So, first of all, let's get new markets. Let's find new consumers. And we'll do that by global trade. And then let's reduce production costs. And we'll do that by outsourcing and flexibilizing all these rigid labor markets. Now, this was aided in turn by the developing world debt crisis, which the oil price shocks, developing countries had to import oil for their own industrialization at enormously high prices. Banks lent very irresponsibly to a number of these governments, including some that they knew were absolutely corrupt at the time, so there was a lot of leakage off the flow. And then the UK and the US decided that to deal with their own inflation problems, they would suddenly jack up the rate of interest, so that when developing countries had to refinance their international debts, they went from maybe 11 or 12% interest to 30% interest, and of course, overnight, their indebted load just doubled. So this led then to a fear that the nascent global financial system would collapse, and so we had neoliberalism 1.0, structural adjustment programs, World Bank, IMF. And what later became the Washington Consensus. I think we're all quite familiar with what the policies or practices were. So states had to sell what they own, no cross-subsidization, economic markets should be substantially deregulated, taxes lower to attract foreign direct investment, user pay, et cetera, et cetera. But we also know, fairly early on, that this led to a number of devastating health outcomes. It really began to sort of shrink and stop the child health revolution because of the impacts on women and on children, on the kind of social services that they were reliant upon in health services. But it also kind of eroded labor markets, the formal labor markets that had been developing or emerging in many of these developing countries. So inequalities rose. So we had the data fairly early on, by the early 1990s. And perhaps unsurprising, that health inequalities, which had begun to shrink between countries, they had begun to go down between countries from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. By the early 1990s, they began to increase again. And they began to increase in correspondence with the increase in inequalities within and between countries. Now, at the same time, we have a kind of a roll out, not a roll back, but a roll out of neoliberalism and the financialization of the economy. So simply stated, investors found that it was much easier to make money from money much faster than to invest it in the real economy of production and consumption. So what I mean by production and consumption, somebody makes something and has to employ people to do that, then people have to buy what's made, and you have all this kind of circulation of finance or money going around. Henry Ford used to express it this way: I have to pay my workers enough money to buy the cars that they make for me. Right? So we had the repeal of bank regulation, deregulation of hedging and commodities, and so one of the reasons why there were sudden food spike prices in the a few years ago. And these new digital technologies, which allowed all of these derivative type gambling that investing banks could make. So banks no longer were just banks in the sense of we take deposits, we lend money to people for their mortgages or for their to companies to invest. They became speculative investors using all of these very highly leveraged kind of gambling bets that they would place. And then a lot of that was the subprime kind of mortgage lending that happened primarily in the United States. And we could look at that as being an aspect of neoliberalism 1.0 and the outsourcing of labor production, because there was a shrinkage, an ongoing shrinkage in the amount of money that people were making in the United States, the middle class and the lower middle class, the working class. But to keep the economy going, they had to continue to buy stuff, most of the stuff coming from China or other places. China, meanwhile, was receiving huge amounts of foreign direct investment to create all these factories for the world. So in order to ensure its own stability, it bought all these kind of really low interest U.S. Treasury bills. And that money basically translated into a huge reservoir of funds sitting in U.S. banks. And these U.S. banks then shoved all of this into mortgages to people on a real estate bubble, so that as their housing price went up, they kept getting more and more in debt so that they could buy more and more of the stuff coming from China. Right? So that's essentially what happened and led to the collapse of the housing market. But what banks also were very good at doing is they bundled up this stuff and all of these bad mortgages and sold them as really good investments to other banks around the world, to pension funds, to private pension allowances, and they were approved by all the bond rating agencies. So when the housing market collapsed, it kind of brought down most of the world's economy with it. But to give you an idea of the scale of what David Korten used to call funny money, this kind of highly leveraged, pixelated, not real money at all, that banks were playing with, is that these are the over-the-counter outstanding derivatives. And so you see in 1998, a little tiny amount on the left-hand side. And as it explodes up to June 2011, and even more recently in June 2012, $710 trillion. That's 10 times more than the total wealth that's produced on the planet, economically measured. So this is just, it's massive and it's toxic. Compared to the foreign direct investment that people actually, investors in one country invest in another country into production and consumption, the daily currency trades, right, three times as much. And even after the financial crisis, after a little slowdown, right back up again. Bottom line here is that if you're a little bit concerned that we missed the opportunity in 2008 to take advantage of that particular crisis to change the toxic beast around, we'll have another one. So there's the good news. It's coming. Of course, then we had 2008. And the outcomes of that have been documented, have been estimated. Some of the kind of negative health effects, just like number one, neoliberalism 1.0, neoliberalism 2.0, and the collapse. So increases in poverty, increases in global unemployment, massive. We have the largest number of unemployed people of employable age on the planet that the planet has ever seen. And most of that is concentrated in the younger population. Then we wonder why we have conflicts. We wonder why we have kind of these problems like ISIS. You take a lot of people, young people, who don't have any future expectancy, don't have a sense of what, kind of what the world as it's currently structured offers to them, and you lump them together You've got good, and this is happening in Africa. It's happening in many parts of the world. This is really, and it's even actually been studied quite effectively that the number one reason why people get involved in these kinds of events is because it gives them a sense of purpose. It feeds them. It gives them money. Right? It makes them feel good. So if our own systems aren't doing that, we shouldn't be surprised. The world's governments, in order to prop up our failing kind of global financial system, the egregious greed of a very small number of 0.01% of the global elite, immediately found in their coffers the ability to cough up $9 trillion. They couldn't fund the Millennium Development Goals, they couldn't fund their own public programs in their own countries, but they could come up with $9 trillion to bail out the banks. And they also did some counter-cyclical spending. All of a sudden, they were born-again Keynesians. Okay, market really screwed up. So now we'll go back to Keynes. We'll sort of say, well, in those periods, then the government has to come in and shore up the economic system by investing more money into production and consumption. So it did a bit of that. But then very, very quickly, within about 18 months of that particular rediscovery of the important role of the state in managing the economy, we had austerity. Structural adjustment goes global. And when you look at the list of what austerity is, it's the same bloody thing as structural adjustment programs. Same stuff, same orthodoxy, same misguided, unempirical, no evidence set of beliefs. And contrary to a lot of assumptions, where this retraction is happening most, it's not in the high-income countries. Yes, it's happening. You know, we know what's going on in Portugal, we know what's happening in Greece, we know what's happening in Italy, we know what's happening here in the UK, it's happening in Canada, right? But where it's happening worst is in the low and middle income countries. So we now face the prospect of about 90% of the world's population under this yoke of government retreat. And we also know what some of the negative health effects are. I've been in Oxford for the last few months working with David Stuckler and his work and his group's work around looking at austerity. Now, part of this is an argument that governments got into debt, and so we have to be concerned about government debt. But if you look at the causes of public debt, well, one of them in the Anglo-American countries, the so-called Anglosphere, is that we've seen remarkable changes in taxation structures over the last 20 or 30 years. In the bailouts and the counter-cyclical spending. In the Eurozone countries, a little bit different, but there was this huge lending to a real estate boom that and bubble that eventually again burst. They bought all of these toxic instruments that American banks had bundled up with the subprime mortgages. Banking bailouts, for example, Ireland's kind of public debt was a result of one person, the Prime Minister at the time, saying we will now, the government will stand and we will bail out and cover all of the debts that private investors in Irish banks had incurred. So we socialized all of that really bad, horrible, awful behavior. Now I want to return to the idea of taxation. And David mentioned this, that this is a really big issue for Medact. I think it is one of the really biggest issues, one of the simplest things we can sort of really start to push on. So my poor country, Canada, right? We've seen huge declines in our marginal tax rates, in capital gains tax, in corporate tax rates, and that has been directly linked or corresponded to a decline in government spending as a percentage of our GDP, right? So we talk about we have an austerity crisis, a fiscal crisis. We elected a right-wing government in 2006, and they immediately put in tax cuts. And since 2006, we've lost $220 billion in foregone tax revenue. Now, this doesn't even talk about the amount that annually flees Canada off to places like Barbados or Cayman Islands in terms of tax haven relief. If we taxed it the same as the original EU 15 countries of around 40% of GDP, we'd raise $156 billion each year. And if we spent at the average social spending per GDP in Canada, we'd be spending $208 billion. But the former finance minister in Canada was very, very concerned. He says, those that suggest that austerity should be abandoned, that's the road to ruin. Well, I could add parenthetically, that's the road to ruin for the 1%, but that's not necessarily the road to ruin for the other 99. It may seem simplistic to emphasize this as a simple matter of taxation, but an American study found that if they raised the rate from 35 to 68%, the top marginal rate, it would have no effect even on conventional economic growth measures within that country. But it would reduce poverty and inequality, stimulate growth. The IMF was a bit more cautious. It sort of said, well, we could go up to 60%. Thomas Piketty's a bit more outrageous in saying 80%, although nobody actually takes that seriously in terms of how, if you taxed at that rate, how would you prevent it from sort of siphoning off and fleeing elsewhere. But an estimate that I looked at, just from 2002 to 2012, because that's the only place the data are available. And if you kind of track and monetize what the value of the global economy is, what the global taxes as a percentage of that economy are, and monetize the difference, what you find is that in 2002, $32 trillion were in untaxed private wealth. And I'm not arguing that we should tax and socialize all forms of wealth. But by 2012, this had almost doubled to $62 trillion. Another way of expressing this is the decline in the effective global tax rate. So we have a huge gap between what wealth exists and what we try to harvest in that wealth for a public good or for a common good. Oxfam, similar to the data that David put up around Medact, basically translated this into what the costs would be of providing basic essential services in terms of preventing premature deaths versus what a very simple kind of tax would be on the world's wealthiest. So little that they wouldn't even notice. So now we ask, if empirically this neoliberal orthodoxy has been fundamentally disproven, the emperor of neoliberalism has no clothes, why is he still king? One, of course, is desperation, that at the time of 2008, politicians didn't know what to do. So they reacted out of what was ever the conventional elite kind of wisdom at the time. Another, a lack of clear economic alternatives, which is why some of the work that Medact is doing is so important. Some of the work that's documented in the Global Health Watch is so important, to be able to identify what policies specifically could be operationalized in a crisis. Because crises, we're not going to achieve those outside of a crisis moment. Politics don't work that way. So that's why I say the optimistic note is that we're going to have more crises. But what we also have to recognize is that we have political leaders who are ideologically committed to this, especially in the Anglosphere countries, who are using the crisis to defend austerity, which has no basis whatsoever, empirically or ethically, to undertake policy changes that they know most of the electorate would not support. So it becomes a convenient way to basically impose an unpopular set of policy prescriptions, blaming it on, well, it used to be, let's blame it on globalization. Now it's, let's blame it on the global financial crisis. Let's blame it on austerity. But the other is these erroneous economic models that existed at the time. So we have a series of oops. The Reinhardt and Rogoff study in 2010 that basically said that governments, when public debt exceeds 90%, then government expenditures actually reduce economic growth. But a big oops. A graduate student went through it and sort of found that there were spreadsheet errors and that public debt disappears. What was important in terms of sinking economic growth was private debt. And that's mostly kind of the bank debts and kind of the consumer debts. Then the IMF, when it looked at Greece, it assumed a fiscal multiplier in an economic crisis of 0.5. Now, fiscal multiplier basically means that for every dollar that the government spends, or for every pound, if you want to put it into British terms, that would actually lead to a decline of 50 pence or 50 cents, because it would only affect growth in the economy at half the level of what the spending was. But when they recrunched the numbers a few years later, they found they were dead wrong, and that the fiscal multiplier is actually between 0.9 and 1.7, and likely at the higher end. Now, a fiscal multiplier means that when the government spends money, it's buying services which employ people, it's buying products that are made by people, which employs people. It directly kind of employs people through its public services, and those people then spend money buying things. So that's how the economic growth kind of multiplies. David Stuckler and his group did a study last year where they looked at estimating fiscal multipliers effects and found that if you look at health, if you look at culture and recreation, you look at education and environment, spending in these areas has a very positive knock-on effect in terms of economic growth. Interestingly, of course, is defense, totally negative. It takes money out of the economy and out of economic growth. So what we can say about this is that government spending actually is not only, especially in some of the social and protection services and health services, not only good for people in terms of the services they provide, but it's good for the economy, conventionally measured. Now, again, some bit of good news here is that more and more economists around the world in all different kinds of places are saying the same thing. So the message is getting much, much louder about the importance of public spending. Okay, so I will conclude by saying, what do we do? So the shorthand policy prescriptions. Restrain the financialized economy. Different ways of doing that in terms of separating commercial investment banking, regulating derivatives, lowering the leverage ratios. The IMF has an interesting working paper basically saying that we need to completely retool banks entirely in terms of how they function. So we need to kind of replace what kind of a banking or global financial model we have with one that's more sustainable, that's more equitable, that isn't going to lead to these systemic crises. Increase progressive taxation within countries and look at the financial transaction tax. If we did that globally, a financial transaction tax on all forms of global currency trades at the very low level of 5 cents for every $100, $8.5 trillion a year. That could go into kind of climate change. It could go into development programs. Also, we need to close down tax havens. And there's some movement in that direction, but the initial efforts by the G20 were singularly unsuccessful. So now we're seeing a little bit of policy options that are on the table for the G20. So again, a little bit of cautious optimism, but it needs continuous pressure because we got fancy banks with fancy lawyers and fancy accountants. And unless there's continuous scrutiny and pressure on governments to keep moving forward with these particular agendas, they'll sort of slip back into the fact that most of their finance, their election financing and their buddies come out of the lobbying. I mean, the lobbying by the financial industry in the UK is huge, and the US is also huge. Declaim austerity for what it is, right? Just shout it out, shout it down. I mean, it really is an emperor with no clothes. And begin to kind of shift our public discourse. So anytime you hear someone talk about a deficit, don't talk about a deficit, talk about fair taxation. When they talk about financial scarcity, talk about inequality, because that's what underpins it. I'm not going to talk about all the different kind of alphabet soup of new trade treaties, but we need to be very cautious and very carefully monitoring and examining. I have a couple of studies right now looking at those trade treaties, because they represent what some theorists call a new constitutionalism that lock in the intellectual property and investor rights of the 1%. But also confront the limits of the economic growth model. A couple of years ago here in the UK, the Sustainability Development Commission came up with their report on prosperity without growth, that there's no credible, socially just, ecologically sustainable way to grow incomes for a world of 9 billion people. And some of the policies that they came up with saying that we had to do if we were actually going to survive as a planet are no different than the ones that sort of arise out of an analysis of neoliberalism and its predatory and unjust set of outcomes. So progressive tax reforms and fairer pay policies with strengthened labor markets, redistribution of work, so that some of us don't have to work 60 hours a week while others work 0 hours a week. We actually sort of try to flatten out that a little bit. And then the clear break into a non-fossil fuel economy. And David touched on that again about one of Medact's particular activities in the coming year. Now, some good news recently. So the US and China kind of have struck a deal on carbon cuts. Although everyone knows Obama's not going to be able to make it happen because of the Republicans now controlling both houses in the US. And Obama pledges $3 billion to a climate change fund, the first substantial kind of delivery, first substantial delivery on a promise that had been made by political leaders for about the last 5 or 6 years. But the ODI just came out with a report released today that found that these governments are still subsidizing fossil fuel to the extent of $88 billion annually. Finally, a bit more optimistic note, we do have the Sustainable Development Goals post-2015, which are a better set of goals than the MDGs. The problems we face with those is that we have too many goals and too many targets, and maybe we don't have the political momentum anymore, and all the countries in the world are sort of not actually moving on the progressive taxation front to be able to sort of finance these goals. But if we were to take a look at all of those 17 goals that are presently kind of enumerated, I think that the 3 goals stand out as being the most important ones to push for. They're not directly about health systems, but they're about reducing inequalities, promoting sustainable consumption, and tackling climate change, and maybe a 4th, universal education for women, because we know that the more educated women are around the world in low and middle income countries, the better things are for virtually everybody. With apologies to Gramsci, it means that we might have a pessimism of the intellect, but the optimism of the will. The health sector is not alone, and as David talked about in terms of Medact's connections, we have popular movements in terms of the Via Campesina, labor organizations, etc. We have an issue where globalization places restraints on governments, but governments have created globalization on the trajectory that it presently is on and can shift that trajectory around. Mobilization in Latin America, and the role of social media. I'm a bit equivocal about what social media might actually be able to do, but I think it's a potential political force that we can utilize. So, in closing, one of the last sections of the book, there's a lot that goes in between, but one of the last sections is a documentation of what could be described as the optimism of the will, where the various groups, primarily going to focus on Latin America, but some in Asia, where we're seeing kind of really large popular mobilizations and organizations that are beginning to shift around the political discourses in different parts of the world. And I think that to the extent that we can connect more with some of that activism happening in more distant areas, it gives us more ammunition in terms of being able to try to fight some of the struggles we have to fight within our own countries. Thank you.
Why don't you stay here?
Oh, okay.
So thank you very much. Ron has given us a huge amount of thought-provoking ideas for action, and started with what I think we all feel quite gloomy view of the world, but ended with a lot of ideas for where we could start, join in the discourse for changing the way the world is at the moment. So we now have a session in which you have a chance to ask questions, make statements, and the room is open, and we have one hand eagerly waiting. Please.
Both speakers, can you all hear me, or do you want a microphone?
Yep.
Wonderful talks from both. I've got so much I could say, but could I just add one element of further concern? In the spirit of deregulation, it is important to realize that what is also not coming under regulation is the industrial military complex. And in many ways, I think that the TTIP development is very similar to developing a transnational beast that is just getting bigger and bigger and feeding on the resources of often the poorest people. And one specific example, which will go back to my fairly narrow interest, which is nuclear war, is that one important body that is not getting nearly enough funds, one important regulatory body that's not getting nearly enough funds, is the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is so feeble that it's not actually able to control the possible leak of civil nuclear power into military programs. That's why we're so worried about Iran. So in general, it's wider than just economic. It impacts on the military as well. And it's not just nuclear weapons, it's conventional weapons, it's the spread of things like robots, killer robots, and matters like that. So I think that it's even wider than just the broader economics of society, but it goes right into the economics of killing.
Thank you very much. That's something else that we need to think about. Other points at the back there? Yeah.
I like your focus on trying to reduce inequality in the future. Perhaps by looking at cooperation. I like your focus on reducing inequality in the future, perhaps by focusing on corporation tax or tax on high earners. But in my head, I've always thought of capital as being globally very, very mobile. Labour at the lowest level is completely immobile, it's shackled down. And there's a spectrum whereby middle class people can occasionally move around quite easily and rich people move around very easily. And that kind of dimension of migration, or the inequality of the power to migrate between low earners, high earners, and then capital, is so obvious to me that I'm wondering any sort of national policy that says let's try to increase corporation tax or a tax on billionaires, for example, comes against the argument that, well, this capital and these high earners are just going to go to another country. And that's quite a powerful counter-argument, and I've been thinking about how to get around that. Maybe you have any ideas about how to get around that problem of the inequality of migration, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good point, and it's the one that economists usually, especially conventional economists, usually make when you try to talk about corporate taxation, or even kind of increasing marginal rates of individual taxation, is that with hypermobile capital, with tax havens, it'll just disappear someplace. Okay, I'm going to use this one for now. Okay, so, yeah, good question, because that conventional economists are concerned about what would happen with capital leakage, capital flight, if you started to impose kind of higher taxation rates. The G20 has made a commitment now, which they announced earlier this year, where they want to put in place a system. They don't know. I mean, it's going to be a couple of years to sort of develop it, and of course, it could be full of little wormholes. But they want to put in place a system whereby capital is taxed in the jurisdiction in which the profits are earned, because that would prevent transfer pricing. That would slow down capital flows for the kind of purpose of avoiding kind of taxation, and then the need for full transparency. In terms of the so-called tax havens and changing the structure. Most of the world's tax havens are either located in Europe or they're protectorates of the UK and the US. So, I mean, politically, they can be closed. They can be shut down. If that happens, then you're beginning to shrink the ability of capital to move around. This isn't going to prevent capital from seeking kind of places to invest in terms of the productive, and consumptive economy, the traditional economy. But a parallel kind of role of increasing global regulation, especially around things like the extractive industries, and there's quite a bit in Global Health Watch 4 about the role of the extractive industries. And unfortunately, once again, my country, Canada, has become the go-to nation for international extractive industries because we give them good tax breaks.
Martin Schweiger from Leeds. One of the things I think we could practically try is to break the link between the decision makers and the lobby groups. And I think we need to, I'd suggest that one of the things we ought to be campaigning on is actually limiting political donations to a very minor sum. If you want to get politically involved, get involved, support them. But buying influence, I think, is what perpetuates an awful lot of what's been said right across. So thanks for two very good starts, but I think we actually have to break the link.
Thank you. Really good point, and something which people may want to lobby on. Other points, questions?
Hi, I've been given the microphone, so thank you. I'm a public health doctor who's paddled upstream to the extent of being a student of social psychology at the moment. Last week I had a very entertaining evening listening to Slavoj Zizek, who I won't try to summarise. I suspect he's an acquired taste. But he did offer an observation that sort of struck me right between the eyes. We find it easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine a different way of living and organising ourselves in order to avoid that. If anybody else was there and wants to correct my interpretation, please feel free. Thank you.
Thank you.
End of the world. Ooh.
Any other questions or points that people want to make? There was somebody here. And then there's somebody right at the back there.
Hello, William House. I was a GP for many years. And in the old days of the medical campaign against nuclear weapons, I used to go out to the local community and actually give them talks. And talks were prepared and we had the material and so on. It's quite easy for people to get the hang of nuclear weapons and what they do. Now, this stuff is very complicated. I would like to go to my community or organise for somebody else to go to the community and explain to them what's happening around them so that they at least understand something. Now, it would be a really, really helpful thing if we had materials that would make that possible. So we can, local experts we can recruit who understand the stuff. It's delivering it to the people, grassroots, ground up, all over the place. I think that's what we need to do, at least one of the things.
Thank you. Some of the answers may be in here. And I think that Ron gave us a number of different areas which we need to get down to as well.
I think trying to sort of talk, like even simplify the talk I gave, just finished, and in a kind of a local community setting, given that I didn't even touch on all of the possible issues I could have touched on, I would kind of think that the best way to do it is take one or two of those kind of threads, but then kind of point out what the underlying set of problems or issues are, which really do relate back to the political economy issues in terms of the ideas of the sovereign markets and individuals, the idea of lower taxes, and why they don't work.
There was a question there, yes.
Thanks. Elizabeth McElderry, GP and Medact. Rather specific question. David mentioned the supplies from Boots to the NHS, and a lot of procurement is in fact international. A lot of good work's been done, particularly on the procurement of surgical instruments, for example, in very poor areas of Pakistan. There's good work done already. I just wondered if Medact could include ethical procurement as a thread in whatever work it's doing on this type of thing. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Nick. I'm a medical student and a global health student under David McCoy before. I read an article a number of years ago by George Monbiot called Pinstripe Pirates. You can look it up. It's great. It's about how tax havens have led to the rise of pirates in Somalia and kind of linking these things together. And since he provides a list, and I'd like to push you on this thing about tax havens, because I would offer that one thing that we can do here in the UK is to specifically bring this conversation into the public about how the UK crown dependencies and overseas territories are the bulk of tax havens in the world, really, between Jersey, Guernsey, the Cayman Islands, and a handful of others, which are within our power. If we decided to take them as a public within government, we could shut them down tomorrow. And that's my interpretation, and I wonder if I could press you for your interpretation of that and whether it would be a useful campaign for Medact.
No, it's not for you. Use a Medact.
No, absolutely, Nick. I think we should press for that. And I agree with what Ron is saying, that tax is such a critical central issue to a whole variety of problems. I mean, you brought up the issue of pirates in the high seas and linking that to tax. So we've got to kind of dismantle this argument that we can't deal with tax avoidance because it's a global problem. That there are national solutions to this global problem. And of course, global cooperation will assist. But this idea that we can't do anything unless everyone else does something is clearly nonsense.
Thank you. I'm Diana Warner from Bristol, a GP and Green Party becoming activist and possibly a local candidate for the Green Party as MP. And my thought was, actually, the Green Party is a party that does understand these issues, that has a good awareness, a very intelligent membership on the whole, and really a democratic party. And I know that as a charity, Medact can't get involved with a political party, but perhaps now it's time actually to do so. It might be, or somehow if the membership all agree, it might be just something to consider.
Thank you. Dave will take that into consideration.
One thing that didn't come out of the talk this morning was shame. And shame of non-taxation has made a marginal impact on the coffee people and even possibly Amazon. I'm not quite sure whether the books have actually changed majorly, but nonetheless the campaigns came and went rather, and I think they need to be maintained, but perhaps more going to the personal as well, with this multiple rising of wealth, the shame of what minute proportion is going to in taxation, or who is not paying their worth, and the Sharia sort of charity fixed rate at 1 or 2%, who is not paying their fixed minimum charitable donation. Something like that is a sort of subtle way of maintaining a community, even if it's not going to do it overnight, but it does have a fairly quick response.
We should kind of maybe get a whole bunch of images of all the kind of corporate elite and the tax evading folks, and we sort of should make them like the emperor that has no clothes with a dollar sign covering up the kind of the embarrassing bits. Shame can work. I'm going to not respond directly, but throw out one other kind of concern. And it goes back to why it is fundamentally important, I believe, that we develop fairly good alternative models for governance and for the political economy, globally and nationally. And my concern is that we're actually seeing a little bit of a move towards a tipping back to kind of little hints that maybe we'll win a little bit on the taxation issue, maybe we'll win a little bit on the tax haven issue, maybe we'll win a little bit on the climate change issue, and then people who are kind of suffering as the dwindling kind of down the social, the economic, and income or wealth gradient, as that kind of stops or maybe flattens out a little bit, will become complacent again, that we will have been bought off with a little tiny bit of crumbs because things look like they're a little bit better now than what they were. Now, that isn't to say that we should sort of continue to promote this depraved, outrageous kind of economic model until it makes us all so miserable we rise up in the masses, which is, that's kind of one possible alternative. But it means that I think we need to be critical in an ongoing way of much more systemic change, and not to be fooled by these little kind of potentially modest shifts that I think we will begin to see because the elites of the world recognize that they don't give a little bit more, their own security will start to be threatened.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Is this working? Yeah. Just to pick up the point about going into the community, Dave in his presentation talked about collaboration with People's Health Movement, Citizens UK. These are both organisations, there are many, that are getting people's testimonies, people's stories, and that builds a lot on the sort of work that happens in India, where people's stories are put together into a very, very powerful advocacy tool to take to local government, and so on. And so, just to quickly give an example, I was at a Citizens UK meeting in Tower Hamlets last week, and they had one extract from a story where a child is not said to the teachers that he doesn't want to go home because his home's too cold. And I mean, kind of very, very short extracts like that are very powerful. So to take it to Medact, it would be very interesting to have the sort of information, simple, and I know it's not simple, information to back the stories with the sort of global analysis that Ron has given, so that it's something that we can go from the bottom in a sort of informed way and bring the two sides together.
It's a very good point, Ruth, and on that, I recall that when we, years ago in public health, we were first really kind of grappling with the social determinants of health. And even in international development work, there's this very simple concept called "but why," like a 3 or 4 year old kid. Until at some point in time, you want to tell your kid because, and stop the "but whys." But in a workshop setting, if you start with a particular real experience and then you just keep stripping back, but why does this happen? Why is the house cold? Oh, because they can't. Why can't they afford? Oh, because of that. Well, why does that happen? And you just kind of keep going back and forth. And if you've got the analytical tools, which will be in the book, in terms of knowing where to drop in those little kind of factoids or points, as well as what the policy alternatives are, that could be a very effective way of being able to do the community education.
And if I can just pick up that at that meeting, I was quite frustrated listening to people who were talking about the very narrow interpretations of what the health is like in Tower Hamlets until the end of the meeting. And then this started coming up. So it wasn't formally asked, but why? But people were doing that themselves. And they were going down, yes, the health services aren't delivering, etc. And then it got on to this example and others about the austerity measures.
Well, I think actually that's a great way to end this interesting session. Ron has given us huge amounts to think about, and there have been some very interesting ideas coming from all of you. I think it's now time for tea or coffee, and our speakers at least deserve it. I'm sure you all do too. So please be back here by 11:30 on the dot, and take into account the fact that it takes time